A white officer forces a black girl to eat from the trash, unaware that her mother is the mayor of the city and is willing to fight for justice. Watch how one intervention changes everything. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Amara's home, casting a warm golden glow on the room. She sat at the edge of her bed, tying her shoes, her mind already racing through the day's tasks. As the recently elected mayor of Greenridge, a small but bustling suburban town, Amara was still adjusting to the weight of her new role. The position brought with it the usual challenges of public office, but for Amara, a black woman in a town with a history of racial division, the stakes felt even higher. Every decision she made was scrutinized, every word dissected. Yet, she was determined to succeed, not just for herself, but for the people who had placed their faith in her. Her 8-year-old daughter, Layla, burst into the room, her boundless energy a stark contrast to Amara's quiet focus. Layla's curls bounced as she leapt onto the bed, holding a crayon drawing she had made of their family. "Look, Mommy, it's us at the park. Can we go today? Please?" Amara glanced at the drawing, a smile breaking across her face. She was in the middle of a particularly challenging week, juggling meetings, budget discussions, and a contentious debate over police reform. But the simple joy in Layla's request pulled at her. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said, standing up and smoothing her blazer. "I have a lot of work today. Maybe later?" "But you promised," Layla pouted, her lower lip trembling in an exaggerated plea. Amara sighed. All right," she relented, kneeling to meet her daughter's eyes. "But only for a little while. You can go play with your friends, and I'll pick you up before lunch." Layla squealed in delight, throwing her arms around her mother. "Thank you, Mommy. You're the best." Amara held her close for a moment, the warmth of her daughter's embrace a welcome reprieve from the mounting stress. Yet, as she watched Layla run off to get ready, a pang of unease settled in her chest. Something about the day felt off, though she couldn't quite place why. The streets of Greenridge were quiet as Amara drove Layla to the park. The town's charm was evident in its tree-lined avenues and neat rows of houses, but Amara knew the darkness that lingered beneath the surface. Greenridge had a history, one that wasn't always kind to families like hers. The neighborhoods were still informally segregated, with wealthier, predominantly white families residing in the northern district, while the southern district, where Amara had grown up, was home to working-class black and Hispanic families. When they arrived at the park, Layla immediately spotted her friends, Jaden and Sophie, near the swings. She hopped out of the car, her small backpack bouncing against her shoulders as she ran to join them. Amara watched her for a moment, her heart swelling with pride. Layla was her everything, her anchor amidst the chaos of politics and societal expectations. Before leaving, Amara rolled down the window and called out, "Stay where I can see you, okay? And no wandering off." "Yes, Mommy," Layla shouted back, already engrossed in the game her friends were playing. Satisfied, Amara pulled away, heading toward the town hall. But the unease lingered, a nagging thought she tried to push aside. At the town hall, Amara's day quickly became a whirlwind of meetings and phone calls. Discussions about budget allocations for community programs clashed with debates over police oversight, a topic that had become increasingly heated in recent months. The local police department had a reputation for heavy-handed tactics, particularly in the Southern District, and Amara had promised during her campaign to address the issue. It was a promise that had won her many supporters, but it also made her a target of criticism and hostility from those who believed the police were above reproach. Despite the chaos, her thoughts kept drifting back to Layla. She checked her phone repeatedly, half expecting a message from the babysitter she had arranged to pick Layla up later. When no messages came, she told herself to relax. Layla was safe. The park was always full of families and children on weekends. Still, the uneasy feeling persisted. Layla, meanwhile, was having the time of her life. She and her friends had created an elaborate game involving imaginary kingdoms and daring rescues. They laughed and ran through the park, their voices carrying on the breeze. It was a scene of innocence, untouched by the complexities of the adult world, but not everyone in the park shared their joy. From a distance, Officer John Hale watched the children. Hale was a veteran of the Green Ridge Police Department, known for his no-nonsense attitude and, to some, an unsettling zeal for enforcing the rules. To others, particularly in the Southern District, he was a symbol of unchecked authority and racial bias. Hale prided himself on maintaining order, a term that often seemed to mean targeting those who didn't fit his ideal of what Green Ridge should be. As he observed the children, something about Layla caught his attention. Her carefree demeanor, her loud laughter, it annoyed him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. To him, she represented a disruption, a reminder of the parts of Green Ridge he wanted to control. With a determined stride, he began walking toward the group, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. Layla noticed him first. She froze mid-laugh, her instincts picking up on the tension in his approach. Her friends followed her gaze, their game forgotten. Hale loomed over them, his voice stern and accusatory. "What are you kids doing? Making a mess?" Layla blinked, confused. "We're just playing." Hale's eyes narrowed. "Playing doesn't give you the right to ruin public property. Clean up your trash." "We didn't leave any trash," Layla said, her voice small but steady. Hale's lips curled into a thin smile, one that lacked any warmth. "Don't argue with me, young lady. You think you're better than the rules?" He gestured toward a nearby trash can. "You like trash so much? Go ahead, dig in. Show me what you've been throwing around." Layla's stomach clenched. She glanced at her friends, hoping one of them might intervene, but they were too scared to move. Around the park, adults looked on, some whispering to each other, but no one stepped forward. The weight of their silence pressed down on her, and she realized she was alone. She shook her head. "I didn't do anything wrong." Hale's expression darkened. He took a step closer, towering over her. "Do as I say, or I'll have to take you in. Is that what you want?" Tears welled in Layla's eyes, but she forced herself to stand tall. "No." "Then move," Hale barked, his voice loud enough to make her flinch. Defeated and terrified, Layla approached the trash can. Her hands trembled as she reached in, pulling out an empty soda can. She held it up, her cheeks burning with shame. "There." Hale watched her, satisfaction flickering across his face. "That's better. Maybe next time you'll think before you disrespect public spaces." Layla dropped the can and ran, her friends chasing after her. She didn't stop until she was out of sight, hidden behind a cluster of trees. Her heart pounded as she sank to the ground, tears streaming down her face. At that moment, a woman in the park quietly stopped recording on her phone. She stared at the screen, her hands shaking. She didn't know who the little girl was, but she knew someone had to see this. The sun dipped lower in the sky as Layla huddled behind the trees, her small body racked with sobs. Jaden and Sophie sat beside her, unsure of what to say. They were just as shaken, their childhood innocence cracked by the encounter with Officer Hale. For Layla, the humiliation clung to her like a shadow, a gnawing ache that wouldn't leave. Her hands were still grimy from the trash can, and every time she looked at them, the memory of Hale's cold stare resurfaced. Sophie hesitated before placing a hand on Layla's shoulder. "We should tell your mom," she said softly. Layla shook her head vehemently, tears streaking her face. "She's busy. She's always busy. I don't want her to know." "But he was wrong," Jaden interjected, his voice trembling with anger. He can't do that to you." Layla wiped her face with her sleeve, her gaze hardening. "It doesn't matter. No one's going to believe us. He's a cop." Nearby, the woman who had recorded the incident reviewed the footage on her phone. The shaky video captured everything: Hale's menacing tone, Layla's terrified compliance, and the stony silence of the onlookers. Her finger hovered over the share button. She knew the risks of posting it. She'd seen what happened to others who dared to expose such moments. But the image of Layla, small and vulnerable, rummaging through garbage, steeled her resolve. She uploaded the video to a local community group with a simple caption: "This is not okay." By the time Amara left the town hall, the video had already begun to circulate. She hadn't seen it yet. Her mind was still preoccupied with the day's battles. Meetings with department heads had turned tense when the topic of police reform arose. Amara's proposal to create an independent oversight committee had been met with stiff resistance from both the police chief and certain council members. The chief, a gruff man named Donovan, had dismissed her concerns as unnecessary meddling. "We don't have a problem, Mayor Carter," he had said, his tone clipped. "This town's safe because we enforce the rules." But Amara knew better. She'd grown up in Greenridge, had seen firsthand how the rules were applied unevenly. Still, the pushback wore on her, and as she drove home, she tried to push it to the back of her mind. She was looking forward to seeing Layla, to hearing her daughter's laughter erase the weight of the day. When she walked through the door, the house was eerily quiet. Amara called out for Layla, but only the babysitter, Maria, emerged. "She's in her room," Maria said, her expression tight. "Something happened at the park. She didn't want to talk about it." Amara's heart sank. She climbed the stairs and knocked gently on Layla's door. When no answer came, she opened it slowly. Layla was curled up on her bed, hugging a stuffed bear. Her face was blotchy from crying. "Layla," Amara said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "What's wrong, baby? Did something happen?" Layla hesitated, her small fingers gripping the bear tighter. "It was a cop," she whispered. "He yelled at us. He made me dig in the trash." Amara felt her chest tighten. "What? Why? What did he say?" Layla's voice trembled as she recounted the encounter. She told her mother about Hale's accusations, his threats, and the humiliating demand he'd made. Amara listened, her emotions oscillating between disbelief and fury. When Layla finished, Amara pulled her close, stroking her hair. "I'm so sorry that happened to you," Amara said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "You didn't deserve that. No one does." As she comforted her daughter, Amara's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She ignored it at first, but when the buzzing didn't stop, she reluctantly picked it up. The screen was filled with notifications, texts, emails, and alerts from social media. Curious, she opened one of the messages. It was a link to a video. Her stomach dropped as she clicked on it and saw Layla on the screen, her terrified face captured in stark clarity. The video played out in agonizing detail, and by the end, Amara's hands were trembling with rage. The video had gone viral within hours, sparking a firestorm of reactions. Comments flooded in, ranging from outrage to indifference to outright hostility. Some demanded justice for Layla, while others defended Hale, accusing Amara of using her daughter to push an anti-police agenda. The divide was stark and immediate. Amara knew she couldn't let this slide. She called her chief of staff, Daniel, instructing him to organize a press conference for the following morning. "We need to address this head-on," she said, pacing the living room. "This is bigger than Layla. It's about the culture that lets something like this happen." But even as she planned her response, the backlash grew. Pro-police groups rallied online, painting Hale as a hero who was unfairly vilified for doing his job. A local talk radio host declared the incident a setup, accusing Amara of orchestrating it to further her political goals. The narrative began to shift, and Amara felt the walls closing in. Meanwhile, Hale sat in his patrol car, scrolling through the comments on his phone. He smirked at the support he was receiving, convinced he'd done nothing wrong. To him, Layla's humiliation was a small price to pay for maintaining order. "Kids need discipline," he muttered to himself. "They need to learn respect." As the night wore on, Amara sat at her desk, poring over her notes for the press conference. She knew this wasn't just about Hale. It was about the entire system that allowed people like him to operate unchecked. But she also knew that taking a stand would come at a cost. Her political opponents were already circling, waiting for her to make a mistake. Upstairs, Layla lay awake, clutching her bear. She replayed the scene at the park over and over in her mind, each detail sharper than the last. She thought of the adults who had watched but said nothing, the friends who had run away, the weight of Hale's words pressing down on her. For the first time, the world felt unbearably heavy. In the darkness, mother and daughter lay awake, each grappling with their own fears. And in the silence of Greenridge, the storm began to brew. The next morning, Amara woke with a sense of foreboding that settled heavily on her chest. She had spent most of the night preparing for the press conference, scribbling down notes and rehearsing responses in her head. The video of Layla's humiliation had continued to spread, and with it, the polarized reactions. She knew that whatever she said today could determine not just her political future, but her ability to protect her daughter and other children like her from the systemic prejudice that had plagued their community for decades. The town hall was already bustling with reporters when Amara arrived. Cameras flashed as she stepped out of her car, microphones thrust in her face. Voices called out questions, but she ignored them, her gaze set firmly ahead. She entered the building, Daniel following closely behind. "Are you ready for this?" Daniel asked, his voice low. He was a steady presence, always by her side, even when the pressures of her position seemed overwhelming. Amara took a deep breath, nodding. "I have to be. It's not just about me." Inside the conference room, a podium had been set up, flanked by the flag of Greenridge. Amara stepped up, the murmurs of the crowd quieting as she began to speak. She started by recounting what had happened to Layla, her voice clear and unwavering. She spoke not just as a mother, but as the mayor of a town that needed change. "My daughter was humiliated by someone who is meant to protect this community," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern that has gone unchallenged for too long. I will not let this go unanswered. We must hold those in power accountable for their actions." As soon as she finished speaking, the questions erupted. Reporters shouted over one another, their questions tinged with skepticism or outright hostility. One particularly loud voice cut through the noise. "Mayor Carter, how do you respond to claims that you're using this incident to push an anti-police agenda?" Amara held her gaze steady, her heart pounding. She knew this question was coming. This is not about being anti-police. This is about being anti-abuse of power. The people of Greenridge deserve a police force that protects them, not one that instills fear in their children. The press conference ended, and Amara left the room, her confidence intact, but the weight of what lay ahead pressing heavily on her. She had drawn a line, and she knew that the pushback would come swiftly. Later that afternoon, Amara received a phone call from Chief Donovan. His tone was clipped, his displeasure barely masked. "Mayor Carter," he began, "I have to say, I don't appreciate the way you publicly attacked one of my officers today. Hale was simply doing his job." Amara gripped the phone tighter. "His job does not include humiliating an 8-year-old girl, Chief. I won't stand for this behavior in my town." Donovan sighed, and Amara could hear the frustration in his voice. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Amara. The department has rules in place for a reason. If we start questioning every officer's actions, we lose control. We lose respect." "Respect isn't something you can enforce with threats and fear, Chief," Amara replied, her voice sharp. "It's earned. And right now, the people of Greenridge deserve better." After hanging up, Amara sat at her desk, her hands trembling. She knew the stakes were high, but Donovan's words only confirmed her fears. There would be no support from within the department. If she was going to take on the systemic issues plaguing Greenridge, she would have to do it without them. Meanwhile, Officer Hale was feeling the effects of Amara's words. He had returned to work that day, his colleagues offering him sympathetic nods and words of support. "Don't worry about it, John," one officer said, clapping him on the back. "The mayor's just trying to make a name for herself. We've got your back." But not everyone was on Hale's side. He could feel the shift even if no one said it outright. Some of the newer recruits gave him wary glances, and a few officers who had grown tired of the department's culture of impunity kept their distance. The scrutiny made Hale's anger fester, and he knew he couldn't let Amara's accusations go unchallenged. That evening, as Amara prepared dinner, she noticed a car idling outside her house. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the police cruiser. The silhouette of a man was visible through the windshield, and for a moment she thought it might be Hale. But then the car pulled away, leaving only the unsettling memory of its presence. She tried to push the thought aside, focusing instead on Layla, who was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing quietly. "Mom?" Layla's voice was hesitant. "Are we going to be okay?" Amara put down the knife she was using to chop vegetables and moved to sit beside her daughter. She looked at Layla's drawing. It was of their family, standing hand in hand in front of their house. But there was a dark figure in the background, a faceless man watching them. "We're going to be okay, sweetheart," Amara said, her voice soft but firm. "No one is going to hurt us. I promise." Layla nodded, but Amara could see the doubt in her eyes. She wished she could make the world a simpler, kinder place for her daughter, but she knew that the best she could do was fight for her, fight for all the children who deserved a better future. As the days passed, the tension in Greenridge grew. Mara's decision to stand up to the police had made her both a hero and a target. Protests began to form, with supporters gathering outside the town hall to demand accountability for Hale's actions. At the same time, counter-protesters, waving "Support Our Police" signs, assembled across the street, shouting their opposition. The divide in the town was palpable, a line drawn between those who wanted change and those who feared it. Amara spent her days meeting with community leaders, listening to their concerns, and trying to bridge the widening gap. She knew that if Greenridge was going to heal, they would need to find common ground. But each meeting only seemed to reinforce how deeply entrenched the divisions were. One afternoon, as she sat in her office, Daniel knocked on the door, his expression grave. "Amara, you need to see this." He handed her a printed email, an anonymous threat filled with hate and venom. It warned her to stop her anti-police crusade or face the consequences. Amara's hands shook as she read it, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I knew this would happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They want to scare me into silence." Daniel nodded, his brow furrowed. "But you're not going to stop, are you?" Amara looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. "No, I can't. If I stop now, what does that say to Layla? What does that say to every other child who looks to me for protection?" The threat was reported, and security around Amara's home was increased, but she refused to be intimidated. She continued her work, meeting with activists, pushing for an independent investigation into Hale's conduct, and planning the next steps in her fight for reform. But it wasn't just Amara who felt the pressure. Layla's experience at the park had left her shaken, and the aftermath had only made things worse. She'd always been outgoing, quick to make friends, but now she found herself shrinking away from others. At school, whispers followed her down the hall, and she overheard some of the other children talking about the video. "That's her," one boy said, pointing, "the girl from the video." Layla kept her head down, her cheeks burning. She wanted to disappear, to pretend none of it had happened. She missed the days when she could just be a kid, when she didn't have to think about police officers or protests or what people thought of her family. One day, after school, Layla's teacher, Miss Rodriguez, asked her to stay behind. "How are you doing, Layla?" she asked gently, kneeling beside Layla's desk. "I know things have been tough lately." Layla shrugged, her eyes focused on her hands. "I'm okay." Miss Rodriguez smiled softly. "You know, it's okay to not be okay. What happened to you was wrong, and it's not your fault." Layla looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. She wanted to believe her teacher, but it was hard. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Officer Hale's face, heard his harsh voice. She felt small and powerless, and no matter how many times her mom told her she was brave, she couldn't shake the fear that had taken root inside her. That evening, Amara found Layla sitting on the porch, staring out at the street. She sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Layla hesitated before speaking. "I'm scared, Mom. What if he comes back?" Amara's heart ached. She pulled Layla closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "He won't. I promise you, I'll do everything I can to keep you safe." "But what if it's not enough?" Layla whispered. Amara closed her eyes, the weight of her daughter's words sinking deep. She wished she could give Layla the certainty she needed, but the truth was, she didn't know what the future held. All she could do was keep fighting, no matter the cost. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, protests, and sleepless nights. Amara's resolve was tested at every turn, but she refused to back down. She knew that the fight for justice was never easy, and that real change required sacrifice. She was willing to make that sacrifice, for Layla, for her community, for the future she believed in. And as the sun set over Greenridge, the town braced itself for what was to come. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back. The days stretched into weeks, and Greenridge became a town on edge, divided not just by opinion but by fear and hope, each fueling the other in an uneasy balance. Amara, more determined than ever, refused to let her daughter's humiliation be just another incident that faded from public memory. She was determined to turn this painful moment into a stepping stone for meaningful change, but each step forward seemed to bring 2 steps of resistance, pushing her to the edge of her strength. Amara woke every morning with a purpose, a fire that had not dimmed despite the sleepless nights and the constant barrage of hate. She knew she had to stay focused, not just for herself, but for Layla, who was still visibly struggling to regain her confidence. The incident had robbed her daughter of the carefree nature she had once possessed, and Amara could feel the weight of it all in her bones. She had tried to shield Layla, but she could not always protect her from the world outside. One of the first things Amara did was call for a private meeting with key community leaders, those she knew could help bring about systemic changes, those who believed in justice and were willing to stand by her. The meeting took place in a modest room at the community center, far from the grandeur of City Hall. Around the table sat representatives from the Southern District, pastors, teachers, social workers, and local activists who had dedicated their lives to Greenridge. They were the soul of the community, the people Amara needed behind her if she hoped to take on the establishment. "I know things are tense," Amara began, her eyes moving from one face to another. "But we cannot back down now. What happened to Layla is a symptom of a larger problem, one we've been ignoring for too long. The police should protect us, not humiliate our children. We need to show them that we won't accept this any longer." The room was filled with nods and murmurs of agreement, but Amara also saw the worry etched on the faces around her. The fear of retaliation was palpable. Many in the room had faced harassment and threats for standing up to the authorities before. Still, they were here. They had chosen courage over safety. Pastor Williams, an older man who had lived in Greenridge all his life, leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "We're with you, Amara, but we need a plan. We need to be smart about this. The more noise we make, the more pushback we'll face." Amara nodded. "That's why we need to be organized. We're calling for an independent investigation into Officer Hale and his conduct. We'll gather testimonies, document everything. And we need to be visible. Peaceful protests, community outreach. We need the people of Greenridge to see us, to understand that this isn't just about my daughter. It's about every child, every family that has been wronged." The discussion continued, ideas flowing, concerns raised and addressed. By the end of the meeting, Amara felt a renewed sense of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight, and that meant everything. But outside the walls of the community center, the situation continued to escalate. As Amara and her allies worked to organize protests and gather evidence, the pushback from the police department grew fiercer. Chief Donovan publicly criticized Amara's actions, calling them divisive and dangerous. He painted her as an agitator, someone who was willing to compromise the safety of Greenridge for her political agenda. "Mayor Carter is turning our town into a battleground," Donovan said during a press conference, his words calculated to instill fear. "Our officers are here to protect the community, and we will not stand by while their integrity is attacked without reason." The message resonated with many in Greenridge, especially those in the Northern District who saw the police as their protectors against the perceived threat of the southern neighborhoods. Pro-police rallies began to form, complete with blue flags and signs that read, "Support our heroes." It was a stark contrast to the protests that Amara's supporters were organizing, which called for accountability and reform. The town's divide grew deeper, and the air was thick with tension. Amara faced backlash not only from the police, but also from within City Hall. Some of her colleagues, previously neutral, began to distance themselves from her. She could see the fear in their eyes, fear of being associated with her, fear of losing support from the more conservative parts of the town. It hurt, but Amara had expected this. True change was never easy, and it was never without sacrifice. One day, as Amara walked into her office, she found Daniel waiting for her, a grim expression on his face. He held up a stack of papers, formal complaints against her, filed by members of the police union. They accused her of misconduct, of creating a hostile environment for law enforcement. "They're trying to discredit you," Daniel said, his voice low. "They want to make you look unstable, like you're abusing your power." Amara felt a rush of anger, but she took a deep breath, calming herself. "Let them. We'll fight this too. We're on the right side of history, Daniel. I won't let them scare me into silence." But despite her resolve, the toll on Amara was becoming evident. She barely slept, her nights spent poring over documents, talking to lawyers, and drafting statements. Layla noticed, her mother's exhaustion a constant presence in their home. She tried to help in her own small ways, drawing pictures to cheer Amara up, keeping her room clean, trying not to complain even when she was scared. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Layla turned to her mother, her eyes wide and serious. "Mommy, are they going to make you stop being mayor?" Amara looked at her daughter, her heart aching. She forced a smile, brushing a curl away from Layla's face. "No, sweetheart. They might try, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm doing this for you, for all of us. Sometimes doing the right thing means standing up, even when it's hard." Layla nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I want to be brave like you." Amara pulled her daughter into a hug, her eyes stinging with tears. "You already are, Layla. You're the bravest person I know." As the protests continued, the stakes grew higher. Amara received another anonymous threat, this time more explicit. It warned her to stop the investigation, to stop the protests, or there would be consequences. The threat shook her, not because she feared for herself, but because of Layla. She couldn't let anything happen to her daughter. Amara called a meeting with her closest supporters, including Pastor Williams and Daniel, to discuss their next steps. They gathered at her house late one night, the atmosphere tense but resolute. "We're not backing down," Amara said, her voice steady. "But we need to be prepared. They're trying to intimidate us, and they might escalate. We need to protect ourselves, but we also need to keep pushing forward. We can't let them win." The group agreed, their determination matching Amara's. They discussed security measures, ways to keep their families safe, and strategies to counter the misinformation that was spreading through the town. The next morning, Amara stood in front of the community center, addressing a crowd of supporters. Her voice rang out strong and clear as she spoke of justice, of the need for accountability, of the future she envisioned for Greenridge, a future where no child would have to fear those meant to protect them. "We are here today because we believe in a better tomorrow," she said, her eyes meeting those of the people before her. "We are not against the police. We are against abuse. We are against fear. And we will not stop until every child in Greenridge can walk these streets without fear, without shame." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in unison. Amara felt the power of their unity, the hope that swelled despite the darkness. It was moments like this that reminded her why she was fighting, why she couldn't give up. But even as she spoke, across town, Officer Hale watched the news coverage with a scowl. He couldn't stand the way Amara spoke about him, about the department. To him, she was a threat to everything he stood for, everything he believed in. And he wasn't alone. There were others in the department who shared his views, who saw Amara as an enemy that needed to be taken down. That evening, as Amara returned home, she noticed a car following her, its headlights bright in her rearview mirror. Her pulse quickened, but she tried to stay calm, driving steadily until she reached her street. The car didn't follow her to her driveway, instead speeding away as she pulled in. Amara sat in her car for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel, the reality of the danger she faced sinking in. Inside, Layla was waiting for her, her eyes lighting up as Amara walked through the door. "Mommy, you're home," she called, running to her. Amara scooped her daughter into her arms, holding her tightly. She wanted to protect Layla from all of this, to shield her from the fear and the threats, but she also knew that the only way to truly protect her was to keep fighting, to change the world they lived in. "We're going to be okay," Amara whispered, more to herself than to Layla. She had to believe it, even if the path ahead seemed impossibly hard. As the days passed, the tension in Greenridge continued to grow. The line between those who supported Amara and those who opposed her had become a chasm, with little room for compromise. But Amara refused to be deterred. She continued to meet with community leaders, to push for an independent investigation, to speak out against the injustices that had been allowed to fester for too long. And even though the threats continued, even though the fear was always there, Amara knew she couldn't stop. She was fighting for Layla, for every child who deserved better. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would keep going, no matter the cost. The tension in Greenridge reached a boiling point on a crisp fall morning, the kind of morning where the air seemed alive with the promise of change. It was the day of the public hearing that Amara had fought so hard to organize, an opportunity for the voices of the people to be heard, an opportunity for truth to come to light. The venue was a large community hall near the center of town, and it was already packed with residents when Amara arrived, her heart pounding with both anticipation and anxiety. This was it. This was the moment she had been working towards, the chance to challenge the very system that had allowed people like Officer Hale to abuse their power unchecked. The weeks leading up to the hearing had been a relentless struggle, filled with late nights, threats, and moments of doubt. But now, as she stood at the entrance of the community hall, she felt something else, a sense of purpose that seemed to carry her forward, as if she were being lifted by the hopes of every person who believed in her. The room was buzzing with tension, reporters jostling for the best angles, community members huddling together, whispering anxiously. On one side of the room, Amara could see her supporters, Pastor Williams, Daniel, and others who had stood by her through every trial. They gave her nods of encouragement, their expressions solemn but hopeful. On the other side, she saw the familiar faces of those who opposed her. A group of officers stood with their arms crossed, their eyes narrowed in disapproval. In the middle of them, wearing his uniform like a shield, was Officer Hale. His face was a mask of defiance, his eyes locked on Amara with a stare that was equal parts disdain and challenge. Amara took a deep breath, her gaze shifting to her daughter, who was seated in the front row beside Maria, their babysitter. Layla's eyes met hers, wide with worry but also with a glimmer of pride. Amara gave her a small, reassuring smile before stepping up to the podium. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying through the stillness of the hall. Thank you all for being here today. We are gathered not out of desire, but out of necessity. What happened to my daughter, Layla, is something no child should ever have to endure. But this is not just about her. This is about a culture of fear that has taken root in our community, a culture that we can no longer ignore. She paused, letting her words sink in. The silence was heavy, charged with the weight of her message. Amara continued, her voice gaining strength. I stand here today as a mother, as a mayor, and as a member of this community, asking for accountability, not just for Layla, but for every child, every family that has been wronged. We must create a system that serves all of us, equally and justly. The hearing moved forward, and testimonies began. One by one, people came forward to speak. Some were parents whose children had faced similar mistreatment. Others were individuals who had lived in fear of the police their whole lives. The stories were heartbreaking, each one adding another layer to the picture that Amara was trying to paint. A picture of a town divided not by geography, but by a system that had consistently failed its most vulnerable. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Officer Hale was called to the stand. He moved with a confidence that seemed almost defiant, his posture rigid as he took his seat. The lawyer representing the city asked him to recount his version of events, and Hale did so with a cold detachment, his voice unwavering. She was being disruptive, he said, his eyes scanning the room but never landing on Amara or Layla. The children were causing a disturbance, and I took action to maintain order. There was no intent to harm, and I was acting within my duties as an officer. Amara could feel her blood boil at his words, the casual dismissal of his cruelty, but she stayed composed, her eyes locked on him, her expression unreadable. The lawyer continued, pressing Hale on his actions. Officer Hale, did you really believe that an 8-year-old girl posed a threat significant enough to warrant the response you gave? Hale's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. I believe in doing my job. If we let even the smallest acts of disobedience slide, it sets a precedent. I was simply enforcing the rules. The lawyer nodded, seemingly satisfied, and stepped back. But it wasn't over. Amara had prepared for this moment, and she wasn't about to let Hale walk away unscathed. She rose from her seat, her heart pounding, and approached the microphone. The room seemed to hold its breath as she faced Hale directly. Officer Hale, she began, her voice steady but charged with emotion. Do you truly believe that forcing a child to dig through a trash can is an appropriate method of maintaining order? Do you understand the impact of what you did to my daughter? For a moment, Hale hesitated. The confidence that had been etched on his face seemed to falter just slightly. He opened his mouth to speak, but Amara continued before he could answer. You speak of maintaining order, of setting a precedent. But what precedent are we setting when we allow those in power to abuse that power without consequence? What message are we sending to our children when we tell them that they are less worthy of respect simply because of where they come from or the color of their skin? Hale's face hardened, his eyes narrowing at her. He was silent, and the room seemed to hang on the edge of her words. Amara pressed on, her voice rising with conviction. This is not about order, Officer Hale. This is about dignity. It's about treating every person, no matter how small, no matter how different, with the respect they deserve. You failed my daughter. You failed this community. And I am here to make sure that this failure is not ignored. The room erupted in murmurs, a mix of shock and support. Hale's face flushed, his mask of confidence cracking as he struggled to maintain his composure. The tension in the room was electric, and Amara could feel the tide turning, if only slightly. The next to speak was Pastor Williams, who had stood by Amara from the beginning. He spoke with a calm, deliberate tone, recounting the stories of those who had come to him over the years, stories of intimidation, of fear, of children who no longer felt safe in their own neighborhoods. "We cannot continue like this," he said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the entire room. "We cannot allow fear to dictate how we live, how we raise our children. This is our home, and we must demand better." As the hearing drew to a close, Amara felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. She had said her piece, had stood her ground, but the outcome was still uncertain. She knew that the forces arrayed against her were powerful, that the path to real change was still long and fraught with obstacles. Outside the hall, a crowd had gathered, waiting for news. Supporters cheered as Amara emerged, their voices rising in a chorus of hope and solidarity. She smiled, lifting a hand in acknowledgement, her heart swelling at the sight of the people who believed in her, who believed in the possibility of a better Greenridge. But even as she felt the warmth of their support, she couldn't ignore the other faces in the crowd, the ones filled with anger, with distrust, the ones who saw her as the enemy, who saw her fight for justice as an attack on their way of life. She knew that this was far from over. That night, Amara sat with Layla on their porch, the cool night air wrapping around them like a comforting blanket. Layla rested her head against her mother's shoulder, her small hand wrapped around Amara's. "Did we win today, Mommy?" Layla asked, her voice soft, filled with the innocent hope of a child. Amara looked up at the stars, her heart heavy with both hope and uncertainty. She didn't want to lie to her daughter, didn't want to promise something she couldn't be sure of. But she also knew that today had been a step forward, a crack in the wall that had stood for too long. "We did something important today, sweetheart," she said finally, her voice gentle. "We spoke the truth, and sometimes that's the first step to winning." Layla nodded, her eyes closing as she leaned against her mother. Amara held her close, her heart filled with both love and determination. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be more battles to fight, more sacrifices to make. But as she sat there, with her daughter safe beside her, she knew she would face whatever came next. She had to. For Layla, for her community, for the future they all deserved. And so, as the stars shone above them, Amara found a quiet strength within herself, a strength that would carry her forward no matter what. The fight was far from over, but she was ready, her heart filled with a fierce love and an unbreakable resolve. The morning after the hearing dawned with a quiet sense of anticipation in Greenridge. The echoes of the previous day still lingered in the air, the tension tangible in the streets, in the cafes, in the hushed conversations of the people. But there was also something else, a sense of possibility, a belief that perhaps things could be different. Amara woke early, her body aching from the exhaustion of the past few weeks, but her spirit was buoyed by the support she had felt from the community. She had stood up to Officer Hale, and more importantly, she had given a voice to those who had been silenced for too long. As she made her way to the kitchen, she found Layla already awake, sitting at the table with a bowl of cereal, her eyes bright as she looked up. "Are we still going to the park today, Mommy?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. Amara smiled, ruffling her daughter's curls. She had promised Layla that they would return to the park once things had calmed down. She wanted to show her daughter that they couldn't be scared away from the places they loved, that they had a right to exist in their community without fear. "Yes, sweetheart," Amara said, her voice soft. "We're going to the park. Today, we're going to show everyone that we belong here." As they prepared to leave, Amara couldn't help but think about what lay ahead. The hearing had been a powerful moment, but she knew it was only the beginning. There was still so much work to be done. An independent investigation into Officer Hale had been launched, but there were many obstacles to overcome. The police department was still resistant, Chief Donovan still dismissive, and the divide in the town was still palpable. But Amara was determined to see this through, to fight for the change that Greenridge needed. They arrived at the park just as the sun reached its peak, casting a warm glow over the grass and trees. Layla ran ahead, her laughter carrying on the breeze as she joined her friends by the swings. Amara watched her, her heart swelling with pride. Layla had faced so much, had endured the cruelty of a system that had tried to strip her of her dignity, and yet here she was, smiling, laughing, unbroken. Amara found a bench nearby and sat down, her eyes never leaving Layla. The park was busy, families and children scattered across the field, their voices a comforting hum. For a moment, Amara allowed herself to relax, to breathe in the simple joy of the day. But the peace was soon interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Amara looked up to see Chief Donovan standing before her, his expression unreadable. He was dressed in his uniform, his presence a stark reminder of the ongoing battle. "Mayor Carter," he said, his voice formal, almost cautious. Amara's posture stiffened, her eyes narrowing as she looked up at him. "Chief Donovan," she replied, her tone matching his. He hesitated, his gaze shifting to Layla, who was swinging high into the air, her laughter ringing out. For a moment, his face softened, and he let out a heavy sigh. "I came to talk," he said, his voice lower, "about the hearing, about everything that's happened." Amara raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "And what exactly do you want to say, Chief?" Donovan shifted on his feet, his eyes returning to hers. "I know we've been on opposite sides of this, Amara. I know you think I'm trying to protect my officers at all costs, but the truth is, I'm trying to protect this town. I've been in law enforcement for over 30 years, and I've seen what happens when people lose faith in the police." Amara listened, her expression guarded. "People have already lost faith, Chief, and it's because of officers like Hale, because of a system that protects them instead of holding them accountable." Donovan nodded slowly, his face drawn. "I know. I've been doing some thinking since the hearing. I heard what those people said, what they've gone through, and I realize now that maybe we need to make some changes, not just for the community, but for the department as well." Amara blinked, taken aback by his words. She had never expected to hear this from Donovan, the man who had been her staunchest opponent. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the internal battle he was fighting to reconcile his beliefs with the reality before him. "What kind of changes are you talking about?" she asked cautiously, her heart pounding. Donovan sighed again, his gaze drifting to the children playing in the park. "I want to work with you, Amara. I want to start an independent oversight committee, like you proposed. I think it's time we rebuild the trust that's been broken. It won't be easy, and I know there will be resistance, but I think it's the right thing to do." Amara felt a surge of hope, a lightness that she hadn't felt in weeks. She nodded, her voice softening. "That's all I've ever wanted, Chief, for us to work together, to make things better, for Layla, for every child in Greenridge." Donovan met her eyes, and for the first time she saw a flicker of understanding, of mutual respect. "Let's make it happen then," he said, extending his hand. Amara hesitated for a moment before taking his hand, shaking it firmly. It wasn't a resolution, not yet. There were still many challenges ahead, still many people who would fight against the changes they were trying to make. But it was a beginning, a small step towards the future she had envisioned for Greenridge. As Donovan walked away, Amara turned her attention back to Layla, who was now running across the field with her friends, her laughter a beacon of hope. Amara knew that this was only the beginning of their journey, that there would be more battles to fight, more obstacles to overcome, but she also knew that they had taken a crucial step forward, that they had begun to dismantle the walls that had stood between them and the future they deserved. The following weeks were a blur of activity. The formation of the Oversight Committee was announced, and while there was backlash from some quarters, there was also a groundswell of support. Amara met with community leaders, police representatives, and local officials, working to create a framework that would ensure transparency and accountability. The process was slow, and there were moments of frustration, but Amara remained steadfast, her focus always on the bigger picture. Officer Hale, meanwhile, had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. It wasn't the justice Amara had hoped for, at least not yet, but it was a start. And as more stories came to light, as more people stepped forward to share their experiences, Amara knew that the tide was beginning to turn. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Amara and Layla returned to the park. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the field, and Layla ran ahead, her laughter echoing across the open space. Amara watched her, her heart swelling with pride and love. She found a bench and sat down, her gaze never leaving her daughter. The park was peaceful, families and children enjoying the last light of day. For a moment, Amara allowed herself to relax, to breathe in the simple joy of the evening. She knew there was still much to do. The Oversight Committee was only the first step, and there were still those who resisted the changes she was trying to bring. But as she watched Layla, free and unburdened, Amara knew that every struggle, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt had been worth it. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of children playing, the murmur of conversation, the gentle hum of life continuing on. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Amara felt a sense of peace, a peace that came not from the absence of struggle, but from knowing that she was on the right path, that she was doing what needed to be done. She looked up at the sky, the stars beginning to appear, and smiled. The fight was far from over, but she was ready. She had her daughter, her community, and a purpose that burned brighter than ever. And as long as she had those things, she knew she could face whatever lay ahead. Layla ran back to her, her face flushed with excitement. "Mommy, come play with us," she called, her voice filled with laughter. Amara stood, her heart light. She took her daughter's hand, and together they ran across the field, the night sky unfolding above them, full of endless possibilities. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with friends and acquaintances so more people can hear these important stories. And of course, watch our other videos. Each story reveals something new and important.